Hi there. If you're here, chances are you're looking for two things: a little bit of history and a lot of sleep. So go ahead, get cozy, dim the lights, pull the blanket up like it owes you rent. Maybe rest your head the way medieval peasants never could, on something soft, clean, and blessedly not filled with hay and regret. Tonight we're not talking about kings or crusades. No. We're diving into something greasier, crispier, slightly more edible: medieval junk food. Because even in a world without vending machines, pizza delivery, or late-night drive-thrus, people still wanted snacks. And somehow they got them. Some were delicious, some were suspicious. All of them were deeply medieval. So close your eyes, forget the fridge, and let's fall asleep somewhere between a frying pan, a festival, and a faint risk of food poisoning. Expectations versus reality. Medieval Europe. The age of chivalry, courtly love, shining armor, and probably dysentery. We like to imagine it as a place of long wooden tables covered in roasted meats, golden goblets of wine, and cheerful peasants dancing in flower crowns. But let's pause that fantasy for a second, because real medieval life, it wasn't exactly a Renaissance fair with turkey legs and acoustic lutes. It was a lot more cabbage and a lot more consequences. Picture this. You wake up in the year 1347. The rooster hasn't crowed yet, but your stomach already has. There's no coffee brewing, no toast popping up, no gentle hum of a refrigerator promising leftovers. Just the sound of your neighbor's pig doing whatever pigs do at dawn, and the distant clang of someone trying to coax fire from reluctant wood. Your day starts with porridge. Again, it's made from whatever grain survived the last harvest, mixed with water that you hope is cleaner than it looks. Sometimes there's milk, if the cow is feeling generous and hasn't wandered off to contemplate her existence in the nearest field. The porridge has the consistency of wet sand and roughly the same flavor profile, but it's warm, and warmth counts for something when your house has more holes than walls. See, we tend to think of history as dramatic and dignified. Knights charging into battle, ladies in pointed hats embroidering unicorns, monks copying beautiful manuscripts by candlelight. But most of the time, people were just hungry. Not heroic hungry, not write a poem hungry, just stomach growling, bread hardened. Is this edible? Hungry. The bread, speaking of which, was an adventure in itself. Made from whatever flour was available, and available could mean anything from proper wheat to ground acorns to something that might have been grain once upon a time. The loaves were dense enough to use as building materials, and probably were on occasion. You'd gnaw on a chunk of it throughout the day, softening it with whatever liquid you could find. Water, if you were lucky. Ale, if you were luckier. Something brown and mysterious that someone assured you was perfectly safe if you were feeling particularly optimistic about life. And while yes, there were feasts, they were rare, reserved for the rich, the royal, or the recently victorious. Picture the lord of the manor celebrating his son's engagement, or a successful harvest, or simply the fact that he hadn't died of plague this month. The great hall would fill with smoke from the cooking fires, the smell of roasting meat mixing with unwashed bodies and whatever passed for perfume in those days. Long tables groaning under the weight of whole roasted animals, their eyes still accusingly staring at the guests. Platters of fowl stuffed with smaller fowl, because subtlety was for people who had enough to eat regularly. But the average person, they were working dawn to dusk, chewing on turnips that tasted like betrayal, and trying to stay alive long enough to see Sunday. Their hands were permanently stained with dirt, their backs permanently bent from labor. They knew every weed that was edible, every mushroom that wouldn't kill you, every way to make bark palatable when times got really desperate. The field stretched out endlessly, divided into strips that belonged to different families. You'd see people bent over their plots, pulling weeds that would end up in that evening's soup. Because waste was a luxury they couldn't afford, everything had a purpose. Potato peels went to the pigs. Bones got boiled for broth. Old bread became the foundation for puddings that bore only a passing resemblance to anything we'd recognize today. Market days brought a different kind of hope. Once a week, if you were lucky to live near a decent-sized town, vendors would set up their stalls in the main square. The air would fill with competing scents: fresh bread from the baker who'd been up since before dawn, cheese with character, and possibly its own ecosystem, dried fish that had traveled farther than most people ever would. There'd be honey, precious and golden, sold by the spoonful to those who could afford such extravagance. Spices that had journeyed from lands so distant they might as well have been imaginary, wrapped in cloth and sold for prices that made grown men weep. But even in this world of mud, plague, and passive-aggressive saints, people found ways to treat themselves. A crispy fritter here, fried in whatever fat was available and dusted with the last precious pinch of sugar. A suspiciously chewy cheese curd there, aged in caves that doubled as storage and probably housing for creatures better left unnamed. And of course, the occasional hot pie filled with mystery meat and silent prayers. The mystery meat deserves its own paragraph, really, because in a world where nothing went to waste, meat could mean anything from yesterday's chicken to last week's rabbit to something that might have been edible when it was alive. The pies were small mercies, pastry wrapped around hope and seasoned with desperation. You'd buy one from a vendor who swore it was lamb, knowing full well it could be anything from pigeon to something that had 4 legs and questionable morals. But it was hot, it was filling, and it was yours. These weren't just meals, they were tiny victories. Warm, greasy reminders that life, while hard, could still surprise you with something a little indulgent, even if it came with bones, bees, or bread soaked in alcohol. The bread soaked in alcohol deserves explanation too. When bread went stale, which happened faster than anyone liked, it didn't get thrown away. It got transformed, soaked in wine or ale until it became something resembling pudding, sweetened with honey if you were fortunate, or with whatever fruit had escaped the attention of birds and small children. These concoctions had names like sops and frumenty, words that sound romantic until you realize they were basically medieval versions of "let's see if this kills us." Seasonal treats appeared like small miracles. Spring brought wild greens that didn't taste like suffering. Summer offered berries that could be eaten fresh instead of dried into leather. Autumn was the time of plenty, relatively speaking, when orchards yielded their treasures and people could pretend for a few weeks that winter wasn't coming to reclaim everything good in the world. The wealthy, of course, lived differently. Their tables groaned under displays of conspicuous consumption that would make a modern food blogger weep with envy. Peacocks served with their feathers reattached, as if death were merely a temporary inconvenience. Jellies molded into the shapes of castles, because when you have enough to eat, you can afford to play with your food. Subtleties. Elaborate sugar sculptures that took days to create and seconds to demolish. Edible architecture that existed purely to prove that you had more money than sense. But even the wealthy knew hunger, not the gnawing daily hunger of the poor, but the seasonal hunger when winter stores ran low and fresh food was still months away. They just had better ways to disguise it. More exotic spices to hide the taste of preservation, fancier names for their desperation. So before we judge the medieval menu too harshly, let's walk a mile in their uncomfortable shoes. Or better yet, lie back, relax, and imagine what it was like to crave something sweet in a world where sugar cost more than your house. To dream of fresh fruit in February, when the last apple had been eaten months ago and the next harvest was a lifetime away. To find joy in simple things. A warm fire on a cold night. Bread that didn't fight back when you chewed it. Ale that tasted like it was made by someone who cared about the outcome. The medieval world was hard, yes, harder than we can really imagine. Sitting here with our refrigerators humming and our grocery stores stocked with foods from every corner of the earth. But it was also human. People fell in love over shared meals of questionable provenance. They gathered around fires to tell stories that made them forget their empty stomachs. They found ways to celebrate, to treat themselves, to create moments of sweetness in lives that often offered more bitter than sweet. And maybe that's something worth remembering as we drift off to sleep in our comfortable beds, our bellies full and our futures secure. Sometimes the best treats aren't the fanciest ones. Sometimes they are just the ones that remind us that we're alive, that we're human, that we can still find reasons to smile even when the world seems determined to offer us nothing but turnips that taste like betrayal. Close your eyes now and imagine the smoke from a medieval kitchen, the sound of laughter echoing off stone walls, the simple pleasure of bread and ale shared with friends who understood that life was hard, but it was still life. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. A day in the life you wake up, but not gently, because it's not an alarm clock that stirs you, it's the rooster, or the neighbor's goat, or the general sound of someone arguing with a chicken outside your window. The rooster, by the way, has terrible timing. He starts his performance sometime around what we'd call 4 in the morning, when the sky is still more black than gray, and the only sensible creatures are fast asleep. But roosters apparently never got the memo about work-life balance. The chicken argument is a daily occurrence. Your neighbor Godwin has this ongoing feud with his prize hen Brunhilde. She's convinced the best place to lay eggs is anywhere except the coop he built for her. He's convinced she's doing it out of spite. They're probably both right. You can hear them through the thin walls. Him pleading in increasingly creative combinations of Old English and what might be swearing, her responding with the indignant clucks of someone who knows exactly what she's doing. Your bed, if you can call it that, is made of straw. Real straw. The kind that pokes you in places you didn't know could itch. There's a wooden frame if you're lucky, but let's be honest. You're probably sleeping on the floor next to your cousin and at least one sheep that wandered in during the night. The sheep's name is probably something practical like Woolbert or Mutton in Waiting. She doesn't ask permission before joining your sleeping arrangements. She just assumes that warmth is a communal resource like water or gossip. The straw needs replacing more often than it gets replaced. What starts as relatively fresh bedding gradually becomes a compressed mat of plant matter, small insects, and the dreams of better sleep. You've learned to arrange yourself around the worst of the pokey bits, creating a human-shaped depression that's yours and yours alone. It's not comfortable exactly, but it's familiar. And in a world where nothing stays the same for long, familiar counts for something, the air is cold. Not crisp and refreshing cold, more like, do I still have toes? Cold. The kind of cold that seeps through everything. Walls, blankets, hope for a warm morning. Winter mornings are particularly brutal when frost decorates the inside of the windows and your breath comes out in little puffs that disappear almost as quickly as your motivation to get up. You reach for a blanket, but it's made of wool, smells faintly of wet dog, and hasn't been properly washed since the last full moon. You wrap it tighter anyway. The blanket has a history. It was woven by your grandmother, who got the wool from sheep that had names and personalities. She'd tell you stories about each thread while she worked, how this patch came from Bertha, who liked to eat flowers, and that section from Old Harold, who had an attitude problem and excellent wool. The smell isn't entirely the blanket's fault. Everything smells a bit like wet dog in medieval times. It's the ode to countryside, a complex bouquet of unwashed humans, animal residents, dampness, smoke, and whatever was cooked last night. You get used to it. The way people get used to traffic noise or political disappointment. It becomes background, part of the fabric of daily life. Morning hygiene is minimal. There's no toothpaste, no toothbrush, no soap with lavender undertones and promises of a better tomorrow. The concept of minty fresh breath is about as foreign as democracy or reliable weather forecasting. If you want to rinse your mouth, you find a bucket of water, probably half frozen, and splash your face with the enthusiasm of someone being punished by a particularly creative deity. The water bucket sits by the door, where it catches rain when the roof leaks and occasionally serves as a drinking fountain for passing livestock. There's usually a film of something on top: dust, leaves, the hopes and dreams of small insects who aim too high. You skim off the obvious debris and hope for the best. The water tastes like iron and optimism, with subtle notes of whatever container it's been stored in. Sometimes you chew mint leaves, sometimes you don't bother. The mint grows wild behind the house, competing with nettles and whatever counts as weeds in this particular corner of creation. When you remember, and when the mint hasn't been claimed by rabbits or weather, you'll grab a handful and chew it while you contemplate the day ahead. It's not exactly refreshing, more like plant-flavored hope, but it's something. Most of the time, you just hope the person you're talking to smells worse than you. This is a remarkably achievable goal. Medieval hygiene was less about cleanliness and more about managing the inevitable. Everyone understood that humans were basically walking ecosystems, and as long as your ecosystem wasn't obviously diseased or attracting flies, you were doing fine. Breakfast isn't served, you find it. Usually it's yesterday's bread, now hard enough to be considered a building material. The bread has achieved that special texture that suggests it could survive a siege, flood, or particularly aggressive chewing. It's not so much stale as transformed, evolved into something that exists in a category between food and geological formation. You soften it with ale, not because you're trying to be fancy, but because water might kill you, and ale might only disappoint you. The ale is homemade, naturally, brewed by someone who learned the art from someone who learned it from someone who probably invented it by accident. It's thick, cloudy, and tastes like liquid bread with commitment issues. The alcohol content varies wildly depending on who made it, when they made it, and whether they were paying attention at the time. If you're lucky, there's a smear of cheese or a cooked onion. The cheese is local, meaning it was made by someone you probably know, from milk produced by a cow you've definitely met. It has character, which is a polite way of saying it could probably clear a room if it wanted to. The onion has been cooked down until it's sweet and soft, a small miracle of transformation that makes the bread almost edible. If you're really lucky, someone made pancakes, thin, greasy, and cooked in pig fat that's been reused since last season. The pig fat deserves its own biography. It started life as part of a pig named something like breakfast or eventual dinner, lived through the slaughter, the rendering, and now enjoys an extended afterlife as a cooking medium. It's been used to fry everything from last Tuesday's fish to this morning's hope for something tasty. Honestly, they're not bad. Just don't think about it too much. The pancakes are thin as parchment and about as reliable. They cook unevenly, creating a map of golden patches and burnt spots that tells the story of whoever was manning the pan. You eat them with your fingers, rolling them up around whatever filling is available. More cheese, cooked vegetables, occasionally a bit of leftover meat if the stars have aligned properly. Then work. No emails, no meetings, no commute involving other people's questionable driving skills. Just survival, which sounds dramatic until you realize that survival, day in and day out, is mostly just very boring work, punctuated by occasional terror and frequent hunger. You might tend fields, herd animals, or stitch clothing. Maybe you're in a town, hammering metal or cleaning chamber pots for a merchant who yells a lot. The fields stretch out in long strips, divided between families who've worked the same patches of earth for generations. You know every stone, every stubborn weed, every place where the plow catches and makes you swear in ways that would surprise your grandmother. Herding animals is like being a therapist for creatures who don't appreciate your efforts. The sheep have opinions about everything, where they want to go, what they want to eat, whether today is a good day for cooperation or chaos. Usually they choose chaos. You spend your morning chasing them away from the neighbor's crops, out of the road, and back to wherever they're supposed to be, all while they stare at you with the judgment only sheep can muster. If you're stitching clothing, you're working by whatever light you can find, usually near a window if there is one, or outside if the weather permits. Your fingers are permanently stained with dye, pricked with needle holes, and cramped from hours of tiny, precise movements. Every garment tells a story: whose it is, what it's for, how long it needs to last. You're not making fashion, you're making survival. In town, work means dealing with people, which is somehow both easier and harder than dealing with animals. The merchant who employs you has strong opinions about everything and the lung capacity to share them at volume. He yells about the quality of your work, the speed of your progress, the state of the world, and occasionally, just because the acoustics in his shop make it satisfying, you've learned to nod at appropriate intervals and keep working. Everything hurts a little. The sun's not even up properly, and you're already carrying buckets, lifting hay, or praying you don't step on a rake again. The rake incident happened once, and once was enough. Rakes in medieval times weren't designed with safety in mind. They were designed to gather things, and if they occasionally gathered part of your foot, well, that was a learning experience. The buckets are wooden, heavy when empty, and impossible when full. You carry them with the careful attention of someone who knows that spilling means starting over, and starting over means delay, and delay means everything else gets pushed back until you're working by moonlight and questioning your life choices. By mid-morning, you're hungry again, which is a problem because there's no snack drawer in medieval life. No vending machines humming with promise. No pantry stocked with easy options. Hunger between meals is just part of the experience, like weather or taxes or the neighbor's chicken drama. But maybe, just maybe, there's a fritter. Someone made them last market day, with apples that weren't entirely rotten, and batter that includes more ale than logic. The apples came from trees that have been growing longer than anyone can remember. Gnarled old things that produce fruit with personalities as varied as the people who eat them. Some are sweet, some are tart, some are clearly plotting something, but you eat them anyway because fruit is fruit. The batter is a mixture of flour, ale, hope, and whatever else seemed like a good idea at the time. Maybe some eggs if the chickens have been cooperative, some milk if the cow is feeling generous, spices if you're celebrating something worth celebrating. It has the consistency of thick porridge and the taste of possibilities. It's fried in pig fat until it's golden brown and just dangerous enough to feel exciting. The fat pops and sizzles, filling the air with the scent of hot oil and impending satisfaction. You have to be careful not to splash yourself because hot fat and medieval medicine don't mix well. But when it's done, when it emerges golden and crispy from its bath of pig fat, it's beautiful. You bite in. It's sweet. It's warm. It's suspiciously chewy. There's definitely apple in there, but there might also be bits of core, seeds, possibly a small insect that was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The texture varies from bite to bite, sometimes crispy, sometimes chewy, occasionally crunchy in ways that make you pause and consider. You eat it anyway, because it's sweet, it's yours, and sweetness is rare enough to be treasured regardless of its complications. Besides, you've eaten worse things and you'll eat worse things again. This is actually pretty good, all things considered. Lunch is whenever you can sit down, which might be noon, or might be whenever the work allows for a break, which could be anywhere from late morning to early afternoon, depending on what's demanding your attention. Time in medieval life is fluid, measured more by the sun's position and the completion of tasks than by any mechanical precision. Usually bread. Again, the bread has become your constant companion, your reliable friend, your occasional enemy when it's particularly stubborn. Sometimes it's the same loaf from breakfast. Sometimes it's a fresh one if you're lucky and someone's been baking. You've developed a relationship with bread that's part necessity, part resignation, part genuine appreciation for its steadfast presence in your life. Sometimes soup, which is just warm water with something floating in it, could be cabbage, could be disappointment. The soup pot is always on, always simmering, always ready to accept whatever ingredients present themselves. Bones from last night's dinner, vegetables that are past their prime but not yet dangerous, herbs that grow wild and free behind the house. It's never the same twice, which keeps life interesting. On good days there's a meat pasty, a little hand pie stuffed with mystery. You don't ask what kind of meat. You don't want to know. The pastry is made from the same basic ingredients as everything else: flour, fat, water, hope, rolled thin and wrapped around whatever protein was available. It might be chicken, it might be rabbit, it might be something that was running around yesterday and is protein today. You eat quickly. There's always more work to do. Meals aren't social events, they're fuel stops, necessary interruptions in the business of staying alive. You eat standing up, walking around with one eye on whatever task is waiting for you. Food is energy, and energy is time, and time is precious when daylight is limited and tasks are endless. Afternoon rolls in with the grace of a cart missing a wheel. The comparison is apt, because you've seen plenty of carts missing wheels. And the way they lurch and struggle and somehow still manage to get where they're going is a pretty good metaphor for how most afternoons feel. Uneven, slightly off balance, but moving forward through sheer determination and the lack of better options. You're tired. Your back aches. You've stepped in things you'd rather not identify. The stepping in things is unavoidable when you share your living space with animals who don't share your opinions about appropriate bathroom locations. You develop a kind of philosophical acceptance about it, along with very practical skills about cleaning your feet. But the sun is finally dipping, and that means one thing: you're closer to dinner. The anticipation of dinner is sometimes better than dinner itself, but that doesn't make it any less real. It's the light at the end of the tunnel, the promise that keeps you going through the afternoon's particular collection of challenges and minor disasters. The afternoon light changes everything. Morning light is harsh and demanding. Noon light is relentless and unforgiving, but afternoon light is gentler, more forgiving, tinged with the promise of rest. It turns ordinary things beautiful. Dust motes dancing in sunbeams, the golden edges of clouds, the satisfied expressions of animals who've spent the day doing whatever it is animals do when humans aren't watching. Dinner is the main event, which doesn't mean it's good. It just means there's more of it. Dinner is when the day's work stops and the day's eating begins in earnest. It's the meal that counts. The one that determines whether you go to bed satisfied or just less hungry than you were. Maybe it's pottage, a thick, lumpy stew made from whatever's in the garden, plus a turnip pretending to be flavor. Pottage is the backbone of medieval cuisine, the reliable foundation upon which everything else is built. It's infinitely adaptable, endlessly variable, and consistently filling. Today's pottage might contain yesterday's leftovers, this morning's vegetable discoveries, and next week's optimism, all simmered together into something that's more than the sum of its parts. The turnip deserves special mention. Turnips in medieval times weren't the forgotten vegetables they are today. They were stars, workhorses, the reliable friends who showed up when other vegetables failed. They stored well, cooked easily, and provided substance when substance was what you needed most. Sure, they weren't exciting, but excitement was overrated when you were hungry. There might be bread soaked in ale again, or a chunk of dried meat if you're celebrating something, like not dying. The bread and ale combination has become something of a signature dish in your repertoire, elevated from necessity to something approaching preference. The ale softens the bread absorbs the ale, and together they create something that's warm, filling, and faintly festive. The dried meat is a special occasion food, preserved from better times and rationed carefully to make it last. It's tough, salty, and requires serious chewing, but it's protein and it's yours. You savor it slowly, partly because it takes that long to chew, and partly because you know it might be a while before you see its like again. Someone pulls out cheese curds. They're squeaky, rubbery, and weirdly satisfying. Cheese curds are one of those foods that seem designed to test your commitment to eating. They squeak against your teeth, bounce back when you bite them, and have a texture that's completely unlike anything else. But they're also fresh, creamy, and somehow comforting in their strange way. You eat them by the handful, pretending not to notice they taste slightly like the inside of a barn. The barn taste is part of their charm, really. It's honest. It tells you exactly where they came from, how they were made, and why they exist. There's something refreshing about food that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. If you're near a fair or a tavern, maybe you get a treat. Fried fish skin sold by a man with 2 teeth and a very loud voice. The fish skin vendor is a local character, someone who's turned what most people would consider waste into a legitimate business. He sources his fish skins from the fishmonger, who's happy to have someone take them off his hands and transforms them into something that's actually quite tasty if you don't think about it too hard. It's crispy, salty, and smells like regret. The regret smell is part of the experience. It's what happens when you take something that was never meant to be food and convince it to become food anyway. But crispy and salty are powerful flavors, and they overcome a lot of philosophical objections. You eat 3 pieces. You don't regret it. Yet. The yet is important because regret, when it comes to questionable food choices, often has a delayed reaction. But for now, in this moment, they're crispy and salty and yours, and that's enough. The tavern, if you're lucky enough to be near one, is a social hub, a gathering place, a source of both food and information. The tavern keeper knows everyone, feeds everyone, and somehow manages to keep track of who owes what to whom. The food is simple but reliable. Bread, cheese, ale, maybe some kind of stew that's been cooking since the tavern opened and will probably still be cooking when it closes. The sun sets, the air cools, the work stops. This is the transition moment, when day becomes evening and work becomes rest. It's marked not by clocks, but by the changing light, the cooling air, the gradual shift from doing to being. The sunset paints everything golden for a few minutes, transforming the ordinary into the beautiful, making even the humblest surroundings look like they belong in a painting. You wash up, sort of, a splash of water, a quick rinse if the river isn't frozen, maybe a rub of herbs if you're fancy. The water is cold, shocking, effective in its way. You wash face and hands, the parts of you that interact most directly with the world, leaving the rest for another day or another season. The herbs are whatever's growing wild and smells good. Mint if you can find it, maybe some lavender if you're in the right place at the right time. You rub them between your palms and pat them onto your skin, carrying their scent with you as you prepare for sleep. You're tired. Your hands are cracked. Your feet hurt. You still have straw in your clothes from last night. The tiredness is bone deep, the kind that comes from a full day of physical work and the knowledge that tomorrow will bring more of the same. Your hands tell the story of your day in calluses and cuts, scratches and stains. Your feet have carried you through fields and streets, over stones and through mud, and they've earned their complaints. The straw is persistent, finding its way into every fold of fabric, every gap in your clothing. You pick out the worst of it, but some will stay with you until tomorrow, a reminder of where you slept and where you'll sleep again. You lie down again, back on the same scratchy bed, wrapped in the same wool blanket that smells like wet February. The bed receives you like an old friend, familiar in all its discomforts. You've learned to appreciate its reliability, the way it's always there, always the same, always ready to support your tired body through another night. Outside, someone's still arguing with that chicken. Godwin and Brunhilde are having another philosophical discussion about property rights and the appropriate location for egg-laying. Their voices carry through the thin walls, a familiar soundtrack to the end of the day. Inside, your stomach is full, not well-fed full, but full enough to sleep. There's a difference between satisfaction and sufficiency, and you've learned to appreciate sufficiency. Your stomach isn't empty, and that's enough. Tomorrow might bring better food, or it might not, but tonight you're not hungry. You curl up, close your eyes, and just before drifting off, you think, maybe tomorrow will bring another fritter. Maybe one without bones this time. The maybe is important. It's what keeps you going. The possibility that tomorrow might be slightly better than today, that the next meal might be a little tastier, that life might surprise you with small pleasures when you least expect them. The bones in today's fritter were a minor adventure, something to navigate around, a reminder that food, like life, doesn't always come perfectly packaged. Sleep comes gradually, settling over you like another blanket, heavier than wool and warmer than anything you own. Your breathing slows, your muscles relax, your mind drifts from the day's concerns toward the night's rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own small victories, its own collection of meals that are more about sustenance than satisfaction. But that's tomorrow's story. Tonight, you sleep the sleep of someone who worked hard, ate what was available, and found moments of sweetness in a life that doesn't promise much beyond another day to try again. And maybe in the grand scheme of things, that's enough. The dark side of civilization. So, you survived the day. Kind of. Your hands are cracked, your tunic smells like goat, and there's something deeply unsettling about the lump in your stew. But you made it. The lump, by the way, defies classification. It's not quite meat, not quite vegetable, not quite anything that should exist in a civilized world. It has the texture of determination and the flavor of regret. You've been poking at it with your wooden spoon for the better part of dinner, trying to decide if it's worth the risk. Eventually, hunger wins over caution, as it usually does. You chew carefully, prepared for disappointment or possibly adventure. Your tunic doesn't just smell like goat. It's absorbed the essence of goat, becoming one with the goat, achieving a level of goatness that the goat itself might envy. The smell has layers: fresh goat, old goat, goat anxiety, goat contentment, and something that might be goat philosophy. It's not unpleasant exactly, just very, very present. Like having a goat follow you around all day, which, come to think of it, actually happened. Now let's talk about the stuff you didn't make it through. Because if there's one thing medieval life excelled at, besides creative uses of pig fat, it was finding new and exciting ways to almost die. Death wasn't just an inevitable endpoint, it was a constant companion, a daily possibility, a topic of conversation as common as weather or the price of grain. Let's start with medicine. You'd think with all the plagues, injuries, and mystery fevers, people might have figured out how the human body works. But no. Medical knowledge in medieval times was like a game of telephone played across centuries, where the original message was probably something sensible. But by the time it reached your local healer, it had transformed into bleed the patient until they feel better or stop complaining. Most treatments involved prayers, herbs, bleeding, or just waiting to see what happened. The prayer to medicine ratio was heavily skewed toward prayer, partly because prayer was free and partly because the alternatives were often worse than the original problem. Herbs were the wild card. Sometimes they helped, sometimes they did nothing. Sometimes they added interesting new symptoms to your existing collection. Doctors, if they existed, wore long bird-beaked masks and carried sticks, not for healing, but to avoid touching you. The masks were supposed to protect them from bad air, which they believed caused disease. The beaks were stuffed with herbs and spices, creating a kind of medieval gas mask that made doctors look like extremely well-dressed crows. The sticks were for poking patients from a safe distance, because apparently the Hippocratic Oath had a clause about maintaining arm's length. They believed in humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and if you had too much of one, time to drain you like a medieval juice box. The theory was that all illness came from an imbalance of these 4 bodily fluids, which sounds reasonable until you realize their solution to everything was remove some. Headache? Too much blood. Stomach problems? Definitely too much yellow bile. Feeling sad? Black bile overflow. Breathing? Probably too much phlegm. The fact that bleeding sick people often made them sicker was attributed to not bleeding them enough. Barber surgeons handled the more hands-on medical work, which explains why your haircut came with a side of minor surgery. Need a tooth pulled? The same guy who trims your hair. Broken bone? Hair guy. Mysterious growth? You guessed it. They advertised their services with the classic barber pole: red for blood, white for bandages, blue for the bruises you'd have afterward. One-stop shopping for all your grooming and medical needs. And then there were the plagues. The Black Death? That wasn't just history class drama. That was real and fast. One day you're selling eels at the market. The next you're being wheeled to the edge of town with a bell tied to your foot. Bring out your dead wasn't a joke. It was Wednesday. The plague moved through communities like gossip, except deadlier and less entertaining. It arrived without invitation, stayed longer than welcome, and left behind empty houses and confused livestock. People tried everything to avoid it. Carrying flowers, the smell was supposed to protect you. Wearing amulets made from unicorn horn, spoiler, not actually from unicorns. Avoiding people who looked sick, sensible. Avoiding people who looked healthy, paranoia. And my personal favorite, flagellating themselves in public to appease God, because nothing says please don't kill me like beating yourself with a whip. The symptoms were creative and disturbing. Buboes, swollen lymph nodes the size of apples, appeared in places lymph nodes had no business being that large. Fever that made people see things that weren't there. Black spots that looked like someone had been playing connect the dots with a very dark pen. And the smell? Oh, the smell. It was distinctive enough that people could diagnose plague by scent alone, which was both useful and deeply unsettling. But death came in other ways too. Infections from small cuts, bad water, falling off a horse, looking at someone the wrong way near a noble's castle. The variety was impressive, really. Medieval life had more ways to kill you than a modern action movie, and most of them were significantly less dramatic. Small cuts were basically death sentences with a waiting period. A scratch from a rusty nail could turn into a swollen, red, increasingly painful reminder that your immune system was fighting a losing battle. People died from splinters, from stepping on thorns, from accidents so minor that they wouldn't even merit a Band-Aid today. The human body's ability to turn tiny injuries into major problems was one of the few things medieval medicine actually understood, which is why they were so quick to amputate everything. Water was a constant gamble. Rivers served as highways, sewers, washing machines, and drinking fountains all at the same time. The same water that carried away your waste in the morning might be flowing into someone else's cooking pot by afternoon. People developed strong stomachs out of necessity, but even strong stomachs had their limits. Dysentery was so common it barely qualified as a disease, more like a recurring subscription to misery. Horses, meanwhile, were beautiful, useful, and absolutely committed to finding ways to injure their riders. They would throw you off for looking at them wrong, step on your foot if you weren't paying attention, and kick you into next week if you approached from the wrong angle. And that was when they were being friendly. Unfriendly horses were basically four-legged weapons with attitude problems. Social class didn't help much. If you were rich, you had fancier food and thicker walls, but you still had no antibiotics and a bath once a month if the moon was right. The rich died more comfortably, with better sheets and more elaborate funeral arrangements, but they still died. Their food was fancier, but not necessarily safer. If anything, the elaborate preparations and exotic ingredients created new opportunities for poisoning, both accidental and intentional. The wealthy had access to better doctors, which sometimes helped and sometimes just meant more expensive ways to make things worse. They could afford the latest medical treatments, like having their blood let by professionals using clean knives instead of whatever sharp object was handy. They could buy medicines imported from distant lands, potions made from rare ingredients, and the services of physicians who had actually read books about medicine, even if those books were completely wrong. If you were poor, well, your best hope was strong knees, a fast prayer, and the ability to digest things not technically meant for digestion. Poor people developed impressive survival skills out of necessity. They could tell which berries were edible, which water was safe to drink, and which symptoms meant stay away from everyone versus tough it out and keep working. They had folk remedies passed down through generations, some of which actually worked, and others of which just gave you something to do while you waited to see if you'd survive. Poverty was its own kind of protection in a way. Poor people couldn't afford to be delicate. They worked through illness, ate questionable food, lived in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors, and somehow many of them survived. Natural selection was working overtime, creating people who could handle almost anything life threw at them, which was fortunate because life threw everything. Religion offered hope and a long list of things to feel bad about. The church was the ultimate multitasker. Spiritual guidance, social services, education, and guilt distribution all rolled into one convenient package. Sneeze too loud? Possibly possessed. Dreamt of cheese? Might be a sign of moral decay. Everything was symbolic, sacred, or slightly cursed. The church had opinions about everything: how you should dress, modestly; what you should eat, not too much; when you should work, not on Sundays; who you should marry, someone appropriate; and what you should think, approved thoughts only. They kept extensive lists of sins, both major and minor, and were remarkably creative about finding new things to feel guilty about. Dreaming was particularly suspicious. Dreams about food suggested gluttony. Dreams about people suggested lust. Dreams about flying suggested pride. Dreams about anything enjoyable were automatically suspect. The safest dreams were about saints, but even those could be problematic if you enjoyed them too much. Sleep became a moral minefield where your subconscious could get you in trouble with the authorities. Monks spent their days copying manuscripts, arguing over whether cats had souls, and occasionally inventing liquor by accident. The manuscript copying was serious business, preserving knowledge, creating beautiful illuminated texts, and developing carpal tunnel syndrome centuries before anyone knew what to call it. Monks were the librarians, scribes, and occasionally the bartenders of medieval society. The cat soul debate was apparently pressing theological business. Cats were useful for catching mice, but suspiciously independent. Did they have souls? Could they go to heaven? Were they in league with the devil? These questions kept some of the greatest minds of the era busy for months at a time. The fact that cats themselves seemed completely unconcerned with the theological implications of their existence only made the debate more intense. The accidental liquor invention was a happy side effect of other experiments. Monks were always brewing, distilling, and fermenting things for medicinal purposes. Sometimes the medicine turned out to be delicious. Sometimes the delicious turned out to be very strong. Sometimes the very strong turned out to be a valuable trade good. And thus, monastic brewing was born, proving that some of the best discoveries happen when you're trying to do something else entirely. Peasants, meanwhile, just tried to stay out of the way of both monks and lords. This was harder than it sounds, because monks and lords had a tendency to show up at inconvenient times with inconvenient demands. Monks wanted souls saved and tithes paid. Lords wanted taxes collected and loyalty demonstrated. Peasants wanted to be left alone to grow their turnips in peace, but peace was a luxury few could afford. The relationship between peasants and authority was like a complicated dance where only one side knew the steps and the other side was trying not to step on anyone's toes. Literally, stepping on the wrong toes could result in fines, punishment, or worse. Peasants developed an impressive ability to look busy, appear respectful, and disappear quickly when necessary. Entertainment? Sure. There was some. If you enjoyed watching animals fight, or people pretending to be animals fighting, medieval festivals had you covered. Entertainment was like medieval medicine. It might help, it might make things worse, but it was definitely memorable. Animal fights were popular because they combined gambling, violence, and the eternal human fascination with watching other creatures solve their problems through combat. Bear baiting, cockfighting, and dogfights drew crowds who cheered, bet, and occasionally got more entertainment than they bargained for when the animals decided to involve the audience. People fighting was even more popular because humans are creative about violence in ways animals can't match. Tournaments featured knights in armor beating each other senseless for honor, glory, and the chance to impress ladies who probably had better things to do. Peasant fighting was less formal but equally enthusiastic. Disagreements over property lines, romantic interests, or whose turn it was to buy the ale could escalate into entertainment for everyone within shouting distance. People pretending to be animals was the height of medieval performance art. Mystery plays featured actors dressed as everything from sheep to demons, often in costumes that looked like they'd been designed by someone who had heard animals described, but never actually seen one. The results were both hilarious and slightly terrifying. There were plays, mostly religious, mostly long, and often terrifying. Medieval theater wasn't subtle. If you were watching a play about the dangers of sin, you knew it because someone dressed as a demon would literally drag sinners off stage while making horrible noises. Subtlety was for people who had time to think about deeper meanings. Medieval audiences wanted their morality lessons delivered with maximum impact and minimum ambiguity. Puppets? Nightmarish. Medieval puppeteers had access to wood, cloth, and apparently an unlimited imagination for creating things that would haunt children's dreams. Puppet shows featured biblical stories, moral tales, and occasionally just random violence performed by wooden figures with painted faces that suggested they'd seen things no puppet should see. Actors, often drunk. Performing was thirsty work, and liquid courage helped when you had to deliver speeches about damnation to audiences who might decide to participate. Drunk actors added an element of unpredictability that kept everyone on their toes. Would Pontius Pilate remember his lines? Would the angel Gabriel fall off the stage? Tune in to find out. Plotlines? Don't sin or you'll be eaten by a demon, repeated with flair. Medieval drama wasn't known for its variety. Most stories followed the same basic formula. Someone is tempted, someone sins, someone suffers consequences that usually involved fire and/or being eaten by something unpleasant. But they told these stories with such enthusiasm that audiences kept coming back for more. Execution Day was a public event. Children came. So did vendors. Because nothing sells candied apples like a man being drawn and quartered. We laugh now, but that was a day out. Bread in one hand, morality in the other. Executions were the ultimate crowd pleasers, combining justice, entertainment, and social education in one convenient package. They were scheduled like modern sporting events, with advance notice so people could plan their day around them. Vendors set up stalls selling food, drink, and souvenirs. Children got to see justice in action while enjoying treats. It was family entertainment with an educational component. The methods were creative and public. Hanging was basic, but drawing and quartering showed real commitment to the spectacle. Burning was reserved for special occasions and heretics. The guillotine hadn't been invented yet, so beheading required skill, strength, and occasionally multiple attempts. The crowd's reaction ranged from cheers to fainting, often depending on the executioner's experience level. The convicted person sometimes got to make a speech, which was either an opportunity for repentance or a final chance to insult everyone who had wronged them. Some took the high road, asking for forgiveness and blessing their enemies. Others used their last words to settle scores and share opinions that had been building up for years. Both approaches drew applause. Superstition ruled the everyday. Bad dreams meant demons. Cows that stared too long? Definitely witches. Left-handed people? Suspicious. And if your crops failed? Time to burn someone. Probably the lady who lives alone and owns a black cat. Sorry, Agnes. Superstition filled the gaps where knowledge should have been, providing explanations for everything that couldn't be easily understood. Why did crops fail? Witchcraft. Why did people get sick? Evil spirits. Why did milk sour? Someone gave it the evil eye. These explanations weren't necessarily accurate, but they were satisfying in a way that random chance never could be. Left-handed people had it particularly rough. In a world where right meant correct and good, being left-handed suggested association with the sinister, literally left in Latin. Left-handed children were forced to use their right hands, creating generations of ambidextrous people who could write with one hand and harbor secret resentments with the other. Agnes, the lady with the black cat, was doomed from the start. Living alone was suspicious enough. Why wasn't she married or in a convent or at least living with relatives? The black cat was just icing on the suspicious cake. When anything went wrong in the village, Agnes was the obvious explanation. Cows stopped giving milk. Agnes. Rain at the wrong time. Agnes. Someone's husband developed wandering eyes. Definitely Agnes and her supernatural cat. The witch trials were community events that combined law enforcement, entertainment, and the settling of old scores. Accusations flew during bad times, when people needed someone to blame for their troubles. The evidence required was flexible. Odd behavior, knowledge of herbs, being unpopular, or just having bad timing could all be considered proof of witchcraft. Testing for witches involved methods that were ingenious in their unfairness. The water test involved throwing the accused into a river. If they floated, they were guilty, because pure water rejected evil, and if they sank, they were innocent, but also dead. The needle test involved searching for spots on the body that didn't feel pain when pricked, evidence of where the devil had touched them. The prayer test required reciting prayers perfectly. Any stumble was proof of demonic interference. But despite it all, the plagues, the pests, the pointed shoes, people laughed. They danced. They told stories. And yes, they snacked. Because even in a world where soup might judge you and your bed doubled as storage for turnips, people still found little joys. The pointed shoes deserve explanation. Fashion in medieval times could be actively dangerous. Shoes with points so long they had to be tied to the knees to prevent tripping. Sleeves so wide they knock things over. Hats so tall they required architectural planning. Beauty was pain, literally, and everyone seemed okay with that. But people adapted. They found ways to laugh at their circumstances, to find humor in situations that would send modern people to therapy. They made jokes about death, sang songs about plague, and told stories that turned their hardships into entertainment. Humor was a survival skill as important as knowing which berries were edible. Dancing happened whenever people could manage it, despite sore feet, tired bodies, and a distinct lack of good music. Someone would start humming, someone else would join in, and before long, there'd be a crowd of people moving to rhythms that existed more in their hearts than in any formal structure. Dancing was rebellion against hardship, a declaration that joy was possible even when everything else suggested otherwise. Stories were the television, movies, and internet of medieval times. People told tales of adventure, romance, magic, and ordinary life made extraordinary through repetition and embellishment. The same stories were told and retold, changing slightly each time, becoming community property shaped by every teller and every audience. Like fritters, like cheese, like eating something fried while watching a morality play about why you shouldn't eat too much fried food. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. People understood perfectly well that they were being told not to enjoy the very things they were enjoying. But understanding the message and following it were two different things entirely. Fritters at theatrical events were a tradition that made perfect sense in a world where everything was symbolic. You could eat something indulgent while watching someone else be punished for indulgence. It was like moral insurance. You were getting the lesson and the pleasure simultaneously, canceling each other out. The cheese was local, strong, and probably disapproved of by several religious authorities. Eating it during a moral play was a small act of rebellion, a quiet assertion that life was for living, not just for learning lessons about why living was dangerous. So if you're lying in bed right now, with soft sheets, clean water, and a working toilet within walking distance, smile. You've already outlived 80% of medieval Europe just by existing after sunset without catching fire or disease. The soft sheets alone would have been luxury beyond imagination. Clean water from a tap would have seemed like magic. A toilet that flushes waste away to somewhere else, where it becomes someone else's problem? Pure fantasy. Air that doesn't smell like a combination of smoke, animals, and human resignation? Impossible to imagine. You have access to medicine that actually works, food that won't kill you, and entertainment that doesn't involve watching people die for educational purposes. You can be left-handed without persecution, own black cats without suspicion, and have dreams about cheese without theological implications. You've won the historical lottery just by being born when and where you were. But maybe, just maybe, there's something to be learned from medieval resilience. From people who found joy in small things, who laughed in the face of absurd hardship, who made the best of situations that offered no good options. They knew how to appreciate simple pleasures because simple pleasures were all they had. So, the next time you bite into something delicious, remember the medieval fritter, probably made with questionable ingredients, definitely fried in recycled pig fat, possibly containing bones, but treasured anyway because it was sweet, it was warm, and it was theirs. Sometimes the best treats aren't the perfect ones. Sometimes they're just the ones that remind us we're alive, we're human, and we can still find reasons to smile even when the world seems determined to offer us nothing but turnips that taste like betrayal. Now close your eyes. Appreciate your soft sheets and your clean water and your working toilet, and drift off to sleep, knowing that you've already accomplished something medieval people could only dream of, surviving a day without anything trying to kill you. Sweet dreams, and may they be filled with cheese without theological implications. A few sleepy facts before you drift off now. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've made it through turnips, toothaches, and terrifying cheese. But before your brain fully floats away into dreamland, let's stroll gently through a few quiet corridors of real medieval food history. Just a handful of facts, nothing too exciting. You're almost asleep anyway. That's the goal. Picture yourself settling deeper into whatever comfortable surface is supporting you right now. Feel your breathing slow down, your muscles relax, your eyelids growing just a little heavier. We're going to take a gentle journey through some fascinating but perfectly sleep-inducing bits of medieval culinary history. Think of this as a bedtime story for people who like their fairy tales with actual historical footnotes. The medieval world, for all its challenges and questionable hygiene, was surprisingly innovative when it came to food. People who lived with constant uncertainty became remarkably creative about feeding themselves, preserving what they could, and making the most of whatever ingredients fate delivered to their doorstep. These weren't just survival tactics. They were the foundations of culinary traditions that echo through our kitchens today. 1. The first fast food stalls. In 12th century London, you could buy hot meat pies on the street. Vendors would set up near busy markets or churches, offering hot, greasy snacks to people with muddy boots and very low standards. Were they fresh? Well, they were warm, and that counted for a lot. Let's paint this picture properly, because it's worth seeing in your mind's eye as you drift toward sleep. London in the 1100s was a city of narrow, winding streets that had evolved organically over centuries. No urban planning, no zoning laws, just buildings growing up wherever someone thought they needed a building. The streets were unpaved, which meant they turned into rivers of mud when it rained and clouds of dust when it didn't. The smell was distinctive, a complex bouquet of unwashed humans, animal waste, cooking fires, and whatever happened to be rotting in the nearest ditch. But amidst this aromatic chaos, enterprising food vendors recognized an opportunity. People needed to eat, and not everyone had time to go home for meals. Workers, travelers, merchants conducting business, they all needed quick, portable food that wouldn't break their modest budgets. And so, the world's first fast food industry was born. Not from corporate strategy meetings, but from simple human necessity. The vendors were characters in their own right. Picture William the pie maker setting up his wooden stall just as the sun crested the rooftops and painted the muddy streets with golden light. William would arrive before dawn, pushing a cart loaded with meat pies that he'd spent the previous evening preparing. The pies were small, designed to be eaten with one hand while the other hand was free for important medieval multitasking. Holding reins, carrying tools, or gesturing emphatically during arguments about the price of wool. His stall was a marvel of portable efficiency. A wooden board balanced on two trestles creating a counter, a charcoal brazier underneath to keep the pies warm, sending up thin spirals of smoke that mixed with the morning mist, a leather apron wrapped around his waist, pockets filled with small coins, and the occasional complaint from customers who'd found unexpected ingredients in yesterday's purchases. The pies themselves were works of practical art. The pastry was sturdy enough to serve as its own bowl, thick and resilient enough to contain whatever filling had been available the night before. The crusts were golden brown when fresh, gradually taking on the darker hues of extended warmth as the day progressed. They were small enough to eat quickly, large enough to constitute an actual meal, and priced at a level that made them accessible to people whose financial planning rarely extended beyond the current week. Some stalls even specialized. Eel pie, boiled beef, mutton pasty. No menus, no prices. You just pointed and hoped it wasn't squirrel. The specialization was born of both practical and commercial considerations. Eel pie vendors, for instance, set up near the Thames, where fresh eels were readily available from the river fishermen. The eels were skinned, chopped, and mixed with onions, herbs, and whatever other vegetables could be found at reasonable prices. The resulting pies had a distinctive flavor, rich, slightly muddy, and unmistakably riverside. Regular customers developed preferences based on which vendors had the best connections with fishermen, the freshest ingredients, or simply the most reliable heating methods. Eleanor the eel woman was legendary in her corner of London. She'd been selling eel pies for nearly 20 years, long enough to know every fisherman by name and to predict the quality of each day's catch by the color of the Thames water. Her pies were consistently excellent, partly because she understood eels and partly because she developed relationships with customers who would warn her about bad batches, unreliable suppliers, or changes in local tastes. The boiled beef specialists worked with different economics. Beef was more expensive than eel, which meant their customers were merchants, skilled craftsmen, or people celebrating something worth celebrating. The beef was slow cooked until it fell apart, mixed with root vegetables and thick gravy, then encased in pastry that could withstand the moisture without falling apart. These pies were hearty, filling, and designed to sustain people through long days of physical labor. Mutton pasty vendors occupied a middle ground between the eel and beef markets. Mutton was affordable but not cheap, flavorful but not luxurious. The meat was often mixed with whatever vegetables were in season. Turnips in winter, greens in spring, whatever appeared in the markets, and seemed compatible with sheep. The resulting pies were reliable rather than exciting, the medieval equivalent of comfort food for people whose lives contained very little comfort. The no menus, no prices approach wasn't casual customer service. It was economic necessity. Prices fluctuated daily based on ingredient availability, weather, competition, and the vendor's assessment of each customer's ability to pay. A well-dressed merchant might pay more for the same pie that a laborer could afford. This wasn't exactly fair, but it was how small businesses survived in an economy where cash flow was always uncertain. The pointing and hoping method of ordering created its own kind of adventure. Customers would approach a stall, survey the available options, and point to something that looked promising. The vendor would wrap the chosen pie in a piece of cloth, or serve it on a wooden plate that might or might not be clean. Payment was negotiated on the spot, often involving coins of questionable origin and authenticity. The squirrel concern wasn't entirely paranoid. Small game was common in medieval cooking, and the line between chicken and small four-legged creature could be surprisingly flexible when business was slow and protein was expensive. Experienced customers learned to identify the telltale signs of non-traditional ingredients, unusual textures, unexpected flavors, or vendors who were evasive about their sourcing methods. But here's the remarkable thing. These early fast food vendors created something genuinely valuable. They fed people who needed feeding, created small businesses that supported families, and established food traditions that would influence cooking for centuries. The idea of quick, portable, affordable food wasn't a modern invention. It was a medieval necessity that evolved into an art form. The church vendors had particularly interesting dynamics. Churches were social centers, gathering places where people came not just for religious services but for news, business, and community connection. Setting up food stalls near church entrances meant capturing customers who were already in a social mood, often celebrating something or gathering for special occasions. Sunday morning was prime time for church vendors. Families dressed in their best clothes, children scrubbed cleaner than usual, everyone prepared for a day that felt different from the working week. After services, people would linger, talking, catching up on gossip, conducting small business transactions, and they would get hungry. The vendors provided a social hub within a social hub, a place to extend the community feeling while satisfying practical needs. The market vendors faced different challenges and opportunities. Markets were business environments, fast-paced and competitive. Customers were there to accomplish specific goals: buying grain, selling crafts, negotiating deals. They needed food that could be eaten quickly without interfering with their primary activities. Market vendors learned to read the rhythm of commerce, timing their offerings to match the energy of the business day. 2. Monks and cheese. Medieval monks were more than just quiet men with fabulous handwriting. They were also food innovators. Many types of cheese we still enjoy today, like Munster, Limburger, and even Parmesan, were perfected in monasteries. Because when you've taken a vow of silence, developing a great rind becomes your main hobby. The monastic approach to cheesemaking was fundamentally different from secular food production. While ordinary people made cheese out of necessity, to preserve milk before it spoiled, monks made cheese as a form of meditation, a way to transform simple ingredients into something approaching perfection. They had time that other people didn't have, patience that came from spiritual practice, and most importantly, they had the luxury of experimentation. Picture Brother Francis in the monastery at Munster sometime in the early 1060s. He's responsible for the dairy operations, which means he spends his days among cows, milk buckets, and the various apparatus required to transform liquid into solid. The monastery owns perhaps 20 cows, each with her own personality, preferences, and opinion about the morning milking routine. Brother Francis knows them all by name: Benedictine, Scholastica, Brigid, Gertrude, and he's learned to work with their individual quirks. The milking begins before dawn, when the air is cool and the cows are cooperative. Brother Francis moves quietly among them, his hands steady from years of practice, his movements economical and gentle. The milk flows warm and white into wooden buckets that he's made himself, following designs passed down from the monastery's founder. The morning milking yields perhaps 15 gallons, enough to meet the monastery's immediate needs with surplus for cheese making. But here's where the monastic advantage becomes clear. While a typical farming family would make simple cheese quickly using whatever culture was available and consuming the results within days or weeks, Brother Francis has different priorities. He has access to written records spanning decades, documenting successful and failed experiments. He has time to age cheese for months or years, testing how different conditions affect flavor development. Most importantly, he has a community of brothers who are willing to taste endless variations in pursuit of perfection. The Munster cheese we know today evolved through literally hundreds of iterations. Brother Francis and his successors tried different culturing methods, various aging environments, and countless combinations of salt, herbs, and environmental conditions. They discovered that the particular combination of mountain air, limestone caves, and carefully controlled humidity in their region created something special. The cheese aged differently there than it would anywhere else, developing complex flavors and that distinctive orange rind that became its signature. The process itself was almost ritualistic. Fresh milk from the morning milking was combined with rennet, an enzyme extracted from calves' stomachs that caused the milk to coagulate. The monks had learned to make their own rennet, a process that required precise timing and careful preservation. Too little rennet, and the cheese wouldn't form properly. Too much, and the texture would be rubbery and unpleasant. Once the curds formed, they were cut with knives made specifically for cheese making, creating uniform pieces that would drain consistently. The cutting required patience and attention. Each stroke had to be clean and precise, ensuring that the curds released their whey without being damaged. Brother Francis would spend an hour or more on the cutting process, working in silence, monitoring the texture and consistency with the focus of someone performing a religious observance. The draining process took place in specially designed wooden frames that allowed the whey to escape while maintaining the cheese's shape. The monks had experimented with different woods, settling on oak for its durability and subtle flavor contribution. The frames were lined with cloth woven in the monastery's textile workshop, creating a perfect environment for the cheese to lose moisture gradually and evenly. But the real magic happened during aging. The monastery's cheese caves were carved directly into the limestone hillside, creating naturally consistent temperatures and humidity levels. Brother Francis would carry the young cheeses down stone steps into chambers that stayed cool even during summer heat. The caves had different microclimates. Some areas were slightly warmer, others more humid, creating opportunities for experimentation. Each cheese was marked with symbols indicating its production date, ingredients, and intended aging period. Brother Francis kept meticulous records noting how environmental changes affected flavor development. He discovered that cheeses aged near the cave entrance developed differently than those stored deeper underground. Cheeses placed on wooden shelves versus stone shelves acquired distinct characteristics. Even the direction the cheese faced seemed to matter. The silence aspect of monastic life contributed to cheese making in unexpected ways. Without constant conversation and social distraction, the monks developed heightened sensitivity to subtle changes in smell, texture, and appearance. Brother Francis could detect the early signs of problems, unwanted mold growth, moisture imbalances, temperature fluctuations, before they became serious. His hands learned to assess cheese readiness through touch, feeling for the perfect balance of firmness and give that indicated optimal aging. Limburger cheese emerged from similar monastic dedication, but with different environmental factors. The monasteries in Belgium and the Low Countries had different limestone compositions, different seasonal patterns, different indigenous bacteria in their caves. The monks there discovered that certain types of surface bacteria created distinctive flavors when properly managed. What others might consider spoilage, they learned to cultivate as a desirable characteristic. Brother Augustine of Limburg spent 40 years perfecting what would become Limburger cheese. He was particularly interested in surface ripening, the way certain bacteria grew on cheese exteriors and gradually worked their way inward, transforming texture and flavor. His journals, preserved in the monastery archives, document hundreds of experiments with different bacterial cultures, aging times, and environmental conditions. The smell that makes Limburger famous and occasionally infamous was actually a sign of perfectly controlled fermentation. Brother Augustine learned to distinguish between beneficial and harmful bacterial growth by scent alone. He could tell from across the cave whether a cheese was developing properly or needed intervention. His nose became a precision instrument, calibrated by decades of careful observation. Parmesan represents perhaps the ultimate monastic cheese achievement, a product so complex and time-consuming that only institutions with long-term thinking could develop it. The monks in northern Italy discovered that certain combinations of milk, aging, and environmental conditions created cheese that improved for literally years. Some wheels of Parmesan were aged for 5, 10, even 20 years, passing from one generation of monks to the next. Brother Marco in Parma began working on what would become Parmigiano Reggiano in 1135. He was 23 years old, newly committed to monastic life, and assigned to the dairy because of his careful attention to detail. By the time he died at age 78, he had created a cheese-making system so refined that it remained virtually unchanged for centuries. The Parmesan process required extraordinary patience. Fresh milk was combined with whey starter saved from previous batches, creating a living culture that connected each new cheese to its predecessors. The cooking process required precise temperature control, achieved by carefully managing wood fires under copper kettles. The timing had to be perfect, too short, and the curds wouldn't develop properly, too long, and they would become tough and granular. After cooking, the curds were pressed into wooden forms and aged in carefully controlled environments for minimum periods that stretched into years. Brother Marco's records show that he experimented with aging periods up to 15 years, documenting how flavor, texture, and nutritional content changed over time. Some of his experimental wheels were still aging when he died, testament to the long-term thinking that monastic life encouraged. Cheese wasn't just food, it was storage, wealth, and the medieval version of aging gracefully. The storage aspect was crucial in medieval economics. Fresh milk spoiled within hours in warm weather, making it useless for long-term planning. But properly made cheese could last for months or even years, transforming perishable abundance into preserved security. Monasteries with successful cheese operations could survive bad harvest years by trading aged cheese for grain, meat, and other necessities. The wealth aspect was equally important. Good cheese commanded premium prices, especially varieties that couldn't be produced everywhere. Monasteries became centers of trade, attracting merchants who would travel considerable distances for access to special cheeses. The monks used cheese sales to fund their religious activities, support charitable works, and maintain their monasteries. Some monasteries developed such reputations for cheese excellence that they attracted pilgrims who came as much for the food as for the spiritual experience. These culinary pilgrimages created cultural exchange networks, spreading cheese-making techniques across regions and countries. A monk who learned Munster techniques in France might later apply those principles to local ingredients in Germany, creating new varieties and expanding the cheese universe. The aging gracefully comparison wasn't just metaphorical. The monks saw parallels between human spiritual development and cheese maturation. Both required patience, careful attention, and acceptance that the best results couldn't be rushed. Both involved transformation, milk becoming cheese, humans becoming more spiritually developed. Both required community support and knowledge passed down through generations. Brother Thomas of Normandy wrote extensively about these parallels in his treatise On the Contemplation of Cheese, completed in 1203. He argued that cheese-making was a form of prayer, a way of participating in divine creation by transforming simple ingredients into complex excellence. His writings influenced monastic food philosophy for centuries, establishing theological frameworks for taking cooking seriously as spiritual practice. The technical innovations that emerged from monastic cheesemaking were remarkable. The monks developed new methods for controlling moisture, temperature, and bacterial growth. They invented specialized tools for cutting curds, pressing cheese, and monitoring aging. They created documentation systems that preserved knowledge across generations. Many of these innovations eventually spread to secular cheesemakers, improving food security and economic opportunity throughout medieval Europe. But perhaps most importantly, the monks demonstrated that food could be more than mere sustenance. Their commitment to excellence, their willingness to experiment, and their patience with long-term projects created culinary achievements that continue to bring pleasure to people 8 centuries later. In a world where most food was produced and consumed out of immediate necessity, they created space for culinary artistry. As you drift toward sleep, imagine Master Roger putting down his quill after months of careful work, looking at the completed manuscript that captures an entire culinary world. The pages contain not just recipes but stories, tales of cooks who transformed simple ingredients into edible art, of royal feasts that dazzled international guests, of techniques that required years to master and lifetimes to perfect. The candlelight flickers across the final page, where Master Roger has written his concluding thoughts. Here endeth the form of Curie, compiled of the chef master cooks of King Richard II, King of England after the conquest, the which was accounted the best and royalest viander of all Christian kings. The boast isn't empty. The recipes preserved in this manuscript represent the pinnacle of medieval culinary achievement. Dishes that required international trade networks, sophisticated techniques, and resources that only the most powerful courts could command. But they also represent something more universal: the human desire to transform necessity into pleasure, to create beauty from humble ingredients, to share the best of what we can offer with the people we care about. The hedgehog and gravy may seem absurd to modern sensibilities, but it reflects a time when food was expected to surprise and delight, when cooks were artists as much as craftsmen, when meals were theatrical experiences that engaged all the senses. The careful construction required to create a realistic pastry hedgehog speaks to the patience and skill that medieval cooks brought to their work, the willingness to spend hours on details that would be appreciated for only moments. The blanc mange, meanwhile, represents the sophisticated palate that medieval diners developed through exposure to international influences. The combination of chicken, almonds, rice, and sugar creates flavors that are both familiar and exotic, comfort food elevated to courtly sophistication. It's a dish that required technical skill to execute properly, but rewarded that effort with something genuinely special. These recipes survive today not just as historical curiosities, but as evidence of human creativity and the universal desire to make eating a pleasure rather than mere survival. They remind us that even in times we think of as harsh and primitive, people found ways to create beauty, to celebrate abundance, and to honor their guests with the best they could offer. Master Roger's cookbook became a bridge between medieval and modern cooking, preserving techniques that would otherwise have been lost and inspiring future generations of cooks to approach their work with ambition and creativity. The manuscript passed through centuries of kitchens, influencing how English cooks thought about flavor, presentation, and the relationship between food and culture. The seasoning challenges that Master Roger noted, the inconsistency of imported spices, the difficulty of preserving delicate flavors, the need to adapt recipes to available ingredients, are timeless cooking problems that every generation of cooks must solve. His solutions, emphasizing flexibility over rigid adherence to formulas, remain relevant to anyone who has ever stood in a kitchen wondering how to make the best of what they have. The manuscript also captures a moment when English cuisine was confident and adventurous, willing to incorporate influences from across Europe and beyond. This cosmopolitan approach to cooking created dishes that were uniquely English, while drawing on the best techniques and ingredients available from anywhere in the known world. It's a model of culinary evolution that remains inspiring today. The royal kitchen where these recipes originated was a place of constant learning and experimentation. Cooks competed to create new dishes that would impress the king and his guests, leading to innovations that pushed the boundaries of what food could be and do. The hedgehog and gravy wasn't just dinner. It was sculpture, theater, and cuisine all combined into one memorable experience. But perhaps the most important legacy of the form of curry is its demonstration that cooking has always been more than mere sustenance. The time, effort, and resources invested in creating these elaborate dishes reflect a deep understanding that food shapes culture, that meals create memories, and that the act of feeding people well is one of the most fundamental expressions of care and hospitality. The manuscript reminds us that even when life was uncertain and resources were limited, people found ways to celebrate abundance, to create moments of joy and surprise, and to transform the basic necessity of eating into something approaching art. The medieval cooks who created these recipes understood that a well-prepared meal could be a gift, a diplomatic gesture, a cultural statement, and a source of pleasure all at the same time. As the candles burn lower in Master Roger's scriptorium and the final words of the cookbook dry on their parchment pages, the legacy of medieval English cooking is preserved for future generations. The recipes will travel from royal kitchens to merchant households, from monastery refectories to tavern tables, adapting and evolving but maintaining their essential character. The hedgehog will continue to surprise dinner guests, the blanc mang will demonstrate English sophistication, and countless other dishes will carry forward the medieval understanding that food should nourish both body and spirit. The cookbook becomes a time capsule, preserving not just recipes but an entire approach to cooking that valued creativity, artistry, and the pleasure of sharing good food with others. Close your eyes now and let the gentle rhythms of medieval kitchen life carry you toward sleep. Picture the careful hands shaping pastry hedgehogs, the patient stirring of almond paste, the satisfied expressions of diners who understand they're experiencing something special. In a world where so much was harsh and uncertain, these cooks created islands of pleasure and beauty, moments when life's difficulties were forgotten in favor of flavors that spoke of skill, creativity, and care. The recipes in the form of curry remind us that humans have always found ways to make the best of what they have, to transform simple ingredients into complex pleasures, and to use food as a language for expressing everything from love to ambition to artistic vision. The medieval kitchen was a place where necessity met creativity, where practical skills became artistic expression, and where the ancient human desire to feed people well found its most sophisticated expression. Sweet dreams, and may they be filled with the satisfaction that comes from work done well, creativity expressed fully, and the timeless pleasure of sharing good food with people who appreciate the effort it represents. The medieval cooks who created these recipes sleep peacefully now, but their legacy lives on in every kitchen where someone takes the time to make something special, to surprise and delight the people they feed, and to remember that cooking is one of humanity's oldest and most essential arts. The pages of the manuscript rustle softly in the dying candlelight, filled with recipes that will outlive empires, influence generations of cooks, and remind future centuries that even in the darkest of ages, people found ways to create light through the simple but profound act of preparing food with skill, imagination, and love. Settle deeper into sleep. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of Brother Francis, checking his cheese caves one final time before evening prayers. The limestone walls are cool against his hands, the air filled with the complex sense of slow transformation. Each wheel of cheese represents months or years of careful attention, patience rewarded with flavors that couldn't exist any other way. The monastery bell tolls across the valley, calling the brothers to vespers. Brother Francis climbs the stone steps from the caves, emerging into moonlight that turns the monastery walls silver. Tomorrow will bring another day of milking, cutting curds, monitoring temperatures, and tending to the slow alchemy that transforms milk into something approaching perfection. In his cell, Brother Francis offers thanks for the day's work, for the cows that provided milk, for the bacteria that create flavor, for the patience that makes excellence possible. He sleeps knowing that deep in the limestone caves, transformation continues without his attention. Cheese aging, flavors developing, time working its quiet magic on simple ingredients. And in the morning, the cycle will begin again. Milking at dawn, careful preparation, patient tending, and the endless, satisfying work of creating something beautiful from something ordinary. It's work that connects him to brothers in monasteries across Europe, all dedicated to the same patient pursuit of culinary excellence. Close your eyes now and let the gentle rhythm of monastic life carry you towards sleep. Picture the quiet caves where cheese ages in perfect darkness, the patient hands that tend each wheel, the centuries of knowledge passed from one generation of monks to the next. In a world that often moved too fast and changed too quickly, they created islands of patience, places where time moved slowly and excellence was worth waiting for. Sweet dreams, and may they be filled with the simple satisfaction of work done well, patience rewarded, and the quiet pride that comes from creating something that will outlast its creator. The cheese wheels in their cool caves will continue aging long after Brother Francis sleeps, just as his techniques will continue feeding people long after his monastery walls crumble. Some gifts to the world age gracefully, improving with time, becoming more valuable the longer they last. That's the kind of legacy worth dreaming about. The patient creation of lasting excellence, one carefully tended wheel of cheese at a time. 3. The spice craze. In the later Middle Ages, spices were the ultimate status symbol. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, they came from far-off lands, carried on ships that smelled like fear and fermented fish. And they were expensive. A pound of black pepper could buy you a cow. So when you see a medieval noble tossing it onto their meat like salt, that was pure culinary flex, and maybe a desperate attempt to hide the fact that the meat was not at its peak. Let's drift back to Venice in the year 1347, where the spice trade was transforming not just cuisine, but entire civilizations. Picture the harbor at dawn, when the morning mist still clings to the water and the first light catches the masts of ships that have traveled impossible distances. These aren't pleasure cruises we're talking about. These are vessels that have survived storms that could swallow cities, pirates who collected ears as trophies, and navigational challenges that made every successful return a minor miracle. The ships arrived from Constantinople, Alexandria, and ports whose names most Europeans couldn't pronounce. They're loaded with cargo that's worth more per pound than gold, silver, or the finest silk. The sailors who man these vessels aren't romantic adventurers. They're desperate men who signed up for voyages where the survival rate hovered somewhere between unlikely and you'd better make peace with your maker before leaving port. Captain Giacomo Benedetti commands one such vessel, the Santa Lucia, a ship that's completed the spice run from Constantinople 17 times without sinking, which makes her practically legendary in maritime circles. Giacomo has been sailing these routes for 23 years, long enough to develop the weather-beaten appearance of someone who's seen things that would send landlubbers to confession. His hands are permanently stained with salt, his eyes permanently squinted from scanning horizons for both opportunity and danger. The cargo hold of the Santa Lucia contains treasures that most people will never see in their lifetimes. Sacks of black peppercorns from India, each one representing weeks of travel through territories controlled by suspicious rulers and opportunistic bandits. Cinnamon bark from Ceylon, carefully wrapped in silk to protect its delicate oils. Cloves from the Moluccas, tiny flower buds that have traveled further than most humans ever will. Nutmeg, cardamom, star anise, each spice with its own story of cultivation, harvest, and the dangerous journey to European markets. The economics of this trade were staggering. A single successful spice voyage could make a merchant wealthy enough to buy property, fund church construction, or arrange advantageous marriages for his children. But the risks were equally enormous. Ships were lost to storms, piracy, or simple navigational errors. Entire cargoes could spoil if moisture got into the holds. Political upheavals could close trade routes overnight, stranding merchants with goods they couldn't sell and debts they couldn't pay. The pepper trade alone was worth fortunes that could ransom kings. Those small, wrinkled black spheres were more valuable than precious metals because they transformed food in ways that nothing else could. A properly peppered dish didn't just taste different, it tasted expensive, exotic, connected to the wider world in ways that local herbs never could. When a medieval lord sprinkled pepper on his roast, he wasn't just seasoning his food, he was displaying his wealth, power, and sophistication to everyone at his table. But let's follow those peppercorns from their origin to understand why they commanded such prices. Picture a pepper plantation in the Western Ghats of India, where monsoon rains create lush growing conditions, and the air itself seems to shimmer with humidity and possibility. The pepper vines climb tall trees in careful cultivation systems developed over centuries. Local farmers whose families have grown pepper for generations tend these vines with the care that European vintners give to their finest grapes. The harvest requires precise timing. Peppercorns must be picked at exactly the right moment. Too early, and they lack flavor. Too late, and they begin to spoil. The farmers climb into the canopy during the early morning hours, when the air is cooler and the work more bearable. They select each cluster by hand, feeling for the subtle differences in texture and firmness that indicate perfect ripeness. Once harvested, the peppercorns are dried in the sun, turning from green to the familiar black that indicates proper curing. This process requires constant attention. The pepper must be turned regularly to ensure even drying, protected from sudden rain, and guarded against birds and animals that find the developing spice as appealing as humans do. A single monsoon storm at the wrong time could destroy an entire season's crop. The dried peppercorns are then packed into specially woven baskets, lined with aromatic leaves that help preserve freshness during the long journey ahead. These baskets are loaded onto ox carts for the first leg of their journey, a trek through mountain passes to trading posts where Indian merchants meet with Arab middlemen who control the next stage of the route. The Arab traders represent another crucial link in the spice chain. They've established relationships with Indian growers, negotiated passage through various kingdoms and territories, and developed the logistics necessary to move goods across vast distances. These aren't simple merchants. They're international businessmen operating complex networks that span continents. From Indian trading posts, the pepper travels to ports like Calicut or Cochin, where it's loaded onto Arab dhows for the voyage across the Indian Ocean to Arabian Peninsula ports. This sea journey involves navigating monsoon patterns, avoiding pirate-infested waters, and managing the constant risk of storm damage. The dhows are remarkable vessels, built without nails using traditional techniques that create ships capable of flexing with ocean swells rather than fighting them. At Arabian ports, the pepper changes hands again, this time to merchants who specialize in the overland routes to Mediterranean markets. The caravan routes through Arabia and the Middle East involve different challenges. Desert travel, where water is more precious than cargo. Negotiations with Bedouin tribes who control various territories, and the constant political complexities of moving goods through regions controlled by competing rulers. By the time our peppercorns reach Constantinople, they've passed through perhaps 6 different sets of hands, each adding markup to cover transportation costs, risks, and profit margins. The final price reflects not just the value of the spice itself, but the enormous infrastructure required to move it from tropical plantations to European dining tables. Venetian spice merchants like Lorenzo Grimaldi have built their fortunes on understanding these complex supply chains. Lorenzo maintains agents in Constantinople, Alexandria, and even more distant ports, men who spend their lives building relationships with suppliers, monitoring political developments, and timing purchases to maximize profit while minimizing risk. Lorenzo's palazzo near the Grand Canal is a testament to the wealth that spice trading can generate. The building itself incorporates architectural elements inspired by Byzantine and Islamic designs, reflecting his business connections with the East. The dining hall features a massive table where Lorenzo entertains customers, suppliers, and political allies with meals that showcase the very spices he imports. But Lorenzo's business success requires more than just buying and selling. He must understand the seasonal patterns that affect spice production, the political developments that could disrupt trade routes, and the changing tastes of European customers. He employs tasters who can distinguish between different grades of cinnamon, accountants who track the complex currency exchanges involved in international trade, and guards who protect his warehouses from theft. The warehouse operations alone are remarkable feats of organization. Spices must be stored in carefully controlled conditions. Too much moisture and they'll spoil, too little and they'll lose their potency. Lorenzo's warehouses feature cedar-lined rooms for cinnamon, sealed containers for pepper, and specialized storage for more delicate spices that deteriorate quickly in the wrong environment. When noble customers visit Lorenzo's establishment, they're entering a temple to sensory experience. The air itself is perfumed with dozens of different spices, creating an olfactory symphony that speaks of distant lands and exotic possibilities. Lorenzo personally demonstrates his wares, grinding small samples of pepper to release their full aroma, breaking cinnamon sticks to show their oil content, and explaining the subtle differences between spices from different regions. The pricing negotiations are theater as much as business. A pound of premium black pepper might cost as much as a craftsman's annual wage, but Lorenzo presents this not as expense, but as investment, in status, in culinary excellence, in connection to the wider world. He tells stories about the origins of his spices, the dangers involved in acquiring them, and the exclusive nature of his supply sources. When Lord Alberti of Ferrara visits Lorenzo's palazzo to purchase spices for his daughter's wedding feast, the transaction involves more than simple commerce. Lorenzo understands that Lord Alberti isn't just buying seasoning. He's buying the ability to demonstrate his wealth and sophistication to wedding guests who will judge his family's status based on the quality of the food served. The pepper that Lord Alberti purchases will be used sparingly, strategically at the wedding feast. A few peppercorns ground fresh over roasted meats, a pinch added to the elaborate sauces that will accompany each course. The guests will recognize the expense involved and understand the message being communicated. This isn't just food. It's diplomacy, status display, and cultural sophistication all rolled into one carefully seasoned meal. But the reality behind the glamour was often less appealing. Many medieval nobles used heavy spicing not just to display wealth, but to mask the flavor of meat that was past its prime. Refrigeration didn't exist, and preservation techniques were limited. A roast that had been hanging in the larder a few days too long could be made palatable, or at least tolerable, with generous applications of expensive spices. The irony wasn't lost on the more sophisticated diners. Using pepper worth a cow's value to disguise meat that should have been fed to the dogs represented both conspicuous consumption and practical necessity. But in a culture where waste was sinful and status was everything, heavily spiced, questionable meat became acceptable dining. The spice craze also drove culinary innovation in unexpected directions. Cooks began developing recipes specifically designed to showcase expensive spices, creating dishes where the seasoning was more valuable than the main ingredients. Pepper sauce became a delicacy in its own right, served alongside meat but almost more important than the protein it accompanied. Medieval recipe collections from this period read like treasure inventories. Take a handful of pepper, worth more than silver, begins one recipe for a sauce designed to accompany roasted fowl. The instructions assume that cost is no object, that the cook has access to spices that most people will never taste, and that the resulting dish will be consumed by people wealthy enough to appreciate both the flavor and the expense involved. The psychological aspects of spice consumption were equally complex. Eating heavily spiced food was a form of consumption that connected diners to exotic locations they would never visit, cultures they would never experience, and trading networks that spanned the known world. Each bite carried the romance of distant lands and dangerous journeys, transforming ordinary meals into adventures. But this conspicuous consumption also created pressure and competition among the wealthy. If one lord served pepper at his feast, his rivals had to respond with even more exotic spices or risk appearing less sophisticated. This escalation drove demand for increasingly rare and expensive seasonings. Long pepper from India, grains of paradise from Africa, galangal from Southeast Asia. The spice trade also had darker implications. The enormous profits involved attracted pirates, unscrupulous merchants, and political manipulation. Wars were fought over spice-producing territories. Entire populations were enslaved to work spice plantations. The wealth that flowed from spice trading funded both magnificent art and terrible exploitation. As you sink deeper into sleep, imagine the sensory overload of Lorenzo's spice warehouse, the competing aromas of cinnamon and cloves, the visual feast of sacks filled with treasure from around the world, the tactile pleasure of running fingers through mounds of peppercorns that represent fortunes in trade. But also picture the long, dangerous journeys that brought these spices to European markets, the human cost of the luxury trade, and the simple fact that people paid cow-equivalent prices for seasonings that we now buy by the ounce. 4. The fish that wasn't meat. Here's a fun religious loophole. In medieval Europe, people fasted a lot. No meat on Fridays, no meat during Lent. But fish wasn't considered meat, which led to some creative interpretations. Beaver tails? Fish. Barnacle geese, which people believed hatched from driftwood. Also fish. Eel? Always fair game, so you could be devout and deeply full of eel. Praise be. The medieval relationship with religious dietary restrictions created one of history's most entertaining examples of creative interpretation. When the Church declared that faithful Christians should abstain from meat on certain days, Fridays during Lent, on various saints' days, and during other periods of religious observance, they probably didn't anticipate the theological creativity this would inspire. Let's visit the monastery of St. Dunstan in the year 1204, during the middle of Lent, when Brother Bernard finds himself facing a culinary crisis that would challenge both his faith and his digestive system. As the monastery's cook, Bernard is responsible for feeding 43 monks through the 6 weeks of Lenten fasting, during which meat consumption is strictly forbidden. This wouldn't be so challenging if the monastery's definition of meat wasn't being stretched like taffy in a creative child's hands. Brother Bernard stands in the monastery kitchen before dawn, contemplating the day's menu while surrounded by ingredients that occupy various positions on the meat-fish spectrum. On the table before him, a beaver tail that arrived yesterday from the monastery's trappers, 2 barnacle geese shot from trees growing near the river, where they allegedly hatched from driftwood, and a bucket of eels that are squirming with what might be interpreted as enthusiasm for their impending culinary transformation. The beaver tail presents the most theologically complex challenge. It's clearly from a mammal, but it spends most of its time in water, has scales instead of fur, and according to local church authorities, qualifies as fish for fasting purposes. The reasoning involves impressive theological gymnastics. Beavers live in water like fish. Their tails look somewhat fish-like, and most importantly, allowing beaver tail consumption during Lent prevents trappers from facing unnecessary economic hardship during religious seasons. Brother Bernard examines the beaver tail with the attention of a scholar analyzing ancient manuscripts. It's large, flat, and covered with scales that catch the morning light filtering through the kitchen windows. The meat underneath is dark and rich, nothing like actual fish, but remarkably similar to the duck that the monks enjoyed before Lent began. But the Church has spoken, and Brother Bernard is not one to question ecclesiastical wisdom, especially when it allows him to serve something more interesting than salt cod for the 3rd consecutive week. The preparation of beaver tail requires techniques borrowed from both meat and fish cookery. Brother Bernard scores the scaled skin in crosshatch patterns, allowing fat to render during cooking. He stuffs the cavity with herbs from the monastery garden, sage, thyme, and rosemary that grow wild in the fields, and wraps the entire tail in wet clay before burying it in coals. The cooking process takes hours, during which the kitchen fills with aromas that smell suspiciously like roasted duck, but are officially fish-scented for religious purposes. The barnacle geese present a different theological puzzle. According to popular belief, endorsed by church authorities and natural philosophers alike, these birds don't reproduce through normal animal mating. Instead, they supposedly grow from special barnacles that attach to driftwood floating in northern seas. The baby geese allegedly hatch directly from these barnacles, never touching land until they're fully formed and ready to fly. This belief system, which sounds absurd to modern understanding but made perfect sense to medieval minds, meant that barnacle geese weren't really born in the traditional sense. They emerged from the sea like fish, spent their early lives attached to floating wood like marine creatures, and therefore qualified as seafood rather than fowl. The logic was airtight within medieval frameworks of natural philosophy, even if it required ignoring certain obvious characteristics like feathers, wings, and the fact that they flew around making bird noises. Brother Bernard's barnacle geese arrived at the monastery through Brother Thomas, the monk responsible for hunting and trapping. Brother Thomas had spent 3 days in the marshlands north of the monastery, waiting for the geese to land in trees growing near the water's edge. According to popular belief, this tree roosting behavior was evidence of their barnacle origins. They were returning to their spiritual home among the driftwood and tidal debris. The shooting of barnacle geese required careful theological justification. Since they weren't technically animals, killing them didn't violate religious prohibitions against taking life during sacred seasons. Brother Thomas approached the hunt with the solemnity appropriate to harvesting seafood rather than the excitement of pursuing game birds. He offered prayers for the souls of the creatures he was about to take, even though technically they didn't have souls in the traditional sense. The geese themselves seemed unaware of their theological status. They flew in formation like regular birds, called to each other in distinctly bird-like voices, and when shot, bled red blood and fell to earth like any other fowl. But Brother Thomas had faith in church doctrine and confidence in the scholarly authorities who had determined their proper classification. If learned theologians declared them seafood, then seafood they were. Preparing barnacle geese for the monastery table involved techniques that acknowledged their dual nature. Brother Bernard plucked them like birds because they had feathers, cleaned them like birds because they had bird-like anatomy, but seasoned them like fish because of their official designation. The result was a dish that tasted exactly like roasted goose, but was served with the clear conscience that comes from following religious law to the letter. The eels, meanwhile, presented no theological challenges whatsoever. Everyone agreed that eels were fish despite their snake-like appearance and the fact that they could survive out of water for extended periods. They lived in water. They had fins, sort of, and most importantly, they were delicious and readily available in the streams and ponds surrounding the monastery. Brother Bernard's relationship with eels was both practical and philosophical. On the practical side, eels were abundant, easy to catch, and could be prepared in dozens of different ways. The monastery's eel traps brought in steady supplies throughout the year, providing protein that was both economical and religiously appropriate. On the philosophical side, eels represented the mysterious nature of God's creation, creatures that seemed to defy easy categorization, appearing almost magical in their ability to move between water and land. The monastery maintained extensive eel fishing operations in the river that bordered their property. Brother Peter, who managed these operations, had developed techniques that maximized harvest while maintaining sustainable populations. The eel traps were marvels of medieval engineering. Carefully positioned wicker baskets that channeled eels into holding areas where they could be kept alive until needed for the kitchen. The variety of eel preparation methods reflected both necessity and creativity. Fresh eels could be grilled, roasted, or stewed. Smoked eels lasted longer and developed complex flavors that improved with age. Pickled eels provided protein during winter months when fresh fishing was impossible. Eel pie became a monastery specialty, with pastry crusts that contained rich, flavorful filling that satisfied even the hungriest monks. But the theological implications of these creative classifications extended far beyond monastery kitchens. Parish priests throughout Europe found themselves arbitrating disputes about what constituted acceptable fasting food. Parishioners brought them questions that would challenge any theologian. Were frogs fish or meat? What about turtles? Did intent matter more than biology? If you accidentally ate something that might be meat, had you violated your fast? Father Marcus, priest of the village of Little Wickham, kept detailed records of the dietary questions brought to him during Lent of 1198. His journal reveals the complexity of medieval fasting law and the creative interpretations it inspired. Dame Alice inquired whether rabbit born in flooded fields might qualify as fish, given their aquatic birth circumstances. Ruled, no, as rabbits clearly possess fur and demonstrate terrestrial behavior regardless of birth location. Young Willem asked about water birds that dive for fish, ruled still birds despite aquatic feeding habits. Intent of the creature does not alter its fundamental nature. Master Geoffrey presented theological argument for considering snails as fish, citing their moist nature and shell similarity to oysters. Ruled acceptable during fasting, as snails demonstrate characteristics more similar to shellfish than land animals. The waterbird question was particularly complex because it involved creatures that seemed to exist in both terrestrial and aquatic categories. Ducks, geese, and swans lived on water but were clearly birds. However, some church authorities argued that birds that spent most of their lives on water and fed primarily on aquatic foods might qualify for fish status. This created regional variations in fasting law that could be confusing for travelers. The rabbit ruling reflected careful theological thinking about the relationship between birth circumstances and essential nature. Just because an animal happened to be born in unusual conditions didn't change what it fundamentally was. A rabbit born in water was still a rabbit, just as a fish born in a shallow pool was still a fish. Location of birth was less important than the creature's intrinsic characteristics. The snail decision represented a compromise between strict interpretation and practical necessity. Snails were widely available, relatively tasty when properly prepared, and could be argued to share characteristics with clearly acceptable shellfish. Father Marcus's ruling allowed his parishioners to supplement their Lenten diet with protein sources that were both accessible and arguably legitimate. These dietary negotiations had significant economic implications. Fishmongers found their businesses booming during fasting seasons, but they also had to navigate the complex classifications that determined what they could legally sell as fish. A fishmonger who misrepresented meat as fish could face both religious and civil penalties, but one who successfully argued for expanded definitions of fish could significantly increase his market. The Monastery of St. Dunstan developed such a reputation for creative Lenten cuisine that neighboring religious communities began sending delegates to observe their food preparation methods. Brother Bernard found himself teaching classes on the proper theological classification of borderline protein sources, combining culinary instruction with religious education. The classes were both practical and philosophical. Brother Bernard would present various ingredients and challenge his students to develop theological arguments for their classification. A turtle shell, for example, might be considered evidence of the creature's affinity with other shell-bearing seafood. Webbed feet could be interpreted as adaptations for aquatic life. The ability to hold breath underwater demonstrated commitment to an aquatic lifestyle. These exercises weren't just academic games. They reflected genuine attempts to understand God's creation and humanity's proper relationship with the natural world. Medieval theologians believed that careful classification of creatures revealed divine patterns and helped humans better understand their place in creation. Dietary laws weren't arbitrary restrictions, but opportunities to contemplate the complexity and variety of divine design. The political dimensions of fasting law were equally complex. Church authorities who allowed flexible interpretations during difficult times could maintain popular support and prevent unnecessary hardship. Those who insisted on strict adherence to narrow definitions might find themselves facing communities where religious observance became associated with hunger and suffering. Bishop Robert of Winchester faced these challenges during the harsh winter of 1203, when traditional fish supplies were depleted and many parishes faced genuine hunger during Lent. His pastoral letter to parish priests encouraged charitable interpretation of dietary law in consideration of divine mercy and human necessity. This diplomatic language allowed local priests to approve protein sources that might not qualify under strict interpretation but prevented starvation during religious observance. The beaver tail classification became so widely accepted that it influenced secular law as well. Tax records from the period show beaver tails being classified as fish for both religious and commercial purposes. This classification affected trade regulations, pricing structures, and even diplomatic relations with territories that controlled beaver hunting grounds. As you settle into sleep, imagine Brother Bernard in his monastery kitchen, carefully arranging a Lenten feast that would satisfy both body and soul. The beaver tail, properly roasted and seasoned, shares the table with perfectly prepared barnacle geese and expertly grilled eels. The monks gather for their meal with clear consciences, knowing they've observed religious law while enjoying food that nourishes both physical and spiritual needs. The theological creativity that allowed this feast reflects the medieval mind's remarkable ability to find solutions that honored both practical necessity and religious commitment. In a world where faith and daily life were inseparably intertwined, dietary restrictions became opportunities for intellectual and spiritual creativity rather than mere obstacles to enjoyment. 5. The cookbook that started it all. In 14th century England, someone wrote The Form of Cury, one of the oldest surviving English cookbooks. It was commissioned by the royal household and included recipes like blanc mange, a chicken almond rice pudding hybrid, and hedgehog in gravy. Yes, hedgehog in gravy. The Middle Ages weren't short on imagination, just maybe seasoning. Picture Westminster Palace in the autumn of 1390, where the most ambitious culinary project in English history is taking shape in a scriptorium that usually handles diplomatic correspondence and royal proclamations. Master Roger, chief clerk to the royal household, sits at a writing desk illuminated by candles that cast dancing shadows across pages covered with recipes that will influence English cooking for centuries to come. Master Roger isn't just a clerk. He's a man who understands that food is politics, culture, and power all served on the same platter. King Richard II has commissioned him to create a comprehensive record of the royal kitchen's finest achievements, a cookbook that will demonstrate English culinary sophistication to rival the great courts of France and Italy. The resulting work, The Form of Cury, the proper method of cooking, will contain nearly 200 recipes that represent the pinnacle of medieval English cuisine. The task requires diplomatic skills as much as literary ones. Master Roger must convince royal cooks to share secrets they've guarded jealously, translate complex procedures into written instructions that make sense to readers who may never have seen the dishes prepared, and organize the material in ways that reflect both practical utility and royal prestige. The royal kitchen operates like a small city, with dozens of specialists responsible for different aspects of food preparation. There's Master William the Saucier, who can create 30 different gravies from the same basic ingredients. Dame Margaret the pastry cook, whose hand pies are architectural marvels of engineering and taste. Brother John the spice master, who maintains the royal spice cabinet like a treasure vault and knows the precise origins of every peppercorn in the palace stores. Each specialist approaches Master Roger's project with different levels of enthusiasm. Master William sees it as an opportunity to preserve techniques that might otherwise be lost when he retires. Dame Margaret worries that sharing her pastry secrets might diminish her value to the royal household. Brother John is convinced that written recipes will never capture the intuitive knowledge required for proper spice blending, but agrees to participate out of loyalty to the king. The blanc mange recipe emerges from weeks of observation and experimentation. Master Roger watches Dame Catherine, the cook responsible for delicate dishes, prepare this sophisticated creation that represents the height of medieval culinary art. The dish combines chicken breast, almonds, rice, and sugar in proportions that create something entirely new. Not quite meat, not quite dessert, but a harmonious blend that demonstrates technical skill and cultural sophistication. The preparation begins with chicken breasts that are poached in wine until they're tender enough to shred by hand. Dame Catherine performs this task with the precision of a surgeon, separating the meat into fibers so fine they almost dissolve on the tongue. The texture is crucial, too coarse, and the dish becomes peasant food, too fine, and it loses the substance required for a royal table. Meanwhile, almonds are blanched, peeled, and ground into paste using techniques that require both strength and patience. The almonds must be processed slowly to prevent the oils from heating and developing bitter flavors. Dame Catherine uses a massive mortar and pestle, working in small batches, adding rose water drop by drop to create a paste that's smooth as silk and white as fresh snow. The rice component requires equal attention. Long-grain rice from distant lands is cooked in almond milk until each grain is separate but tender. The cooking liquid is infused with mastic, a resin from Mediterranean trees that adds subtle complexity to the flavor profile. The rice must be perfectly done, firm enough to maintain structure but soft enough to blend seamlessly with the other ingredients. The final assembly is culinary theater. Dame Catherine combines the shredded chicken, almond paste, and rice in proportions that she measures by eye and experience rather than written weights. She adds sugar imported from Cyprus, salt from the royal stores, and a touch of ginger that transforms the mixture from simple ingredients into sophisticated cuisine. The result is molded into elegant shapes and garnished with pomegranate seeds that provide color contrast and subtle tartness. Master Roger struggles to capture these processes in written form. How do you describe the exact texture of properly shredded chicken to someone who has never seen the technique performed? How do you convey the subtle visual cues that indicate when almond paste has reached perfect consistency? His early drafts are filled with crossed-out words and marginal notes as he tries to translate hands-on knowledge into written instructions. The hedgehog and gravy recipe presents different challenges entirely. This isn't actually hedgehog. It's an elaborate pastry creation designed to look like the spiny creature while containing a rich mixture of pork, veal, and exotic seasonings. The dish represents medieval cuisine's fascination with visual illusion and culinary surprise, where food was expected to entertain as well as nourish. Master Edmund, the pastry architect, is responsible for this creation, and he approaches it with the seriousness of someone designing cathedral facades. The pastry must be sturdy enough to hold its shape during cooking, but tender enough to eat with pleasure. The spines are created using techniques borrowed from armor making, with thin strips of pastry arranged to create realistic texture while allowing heat to penetrate the filling. The filling itself is a masterpiece of medieval flavor engineering. Ground pork provides richness, veal adds delicacy, and the mixture is seasoned with spices that cost more than most people earn in a year. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves are combined in proportions that Master Edmund has perfected through decades of experimentation. The mixture is bound with eggs and enriched with marrow from beef bones, creating a filling that's both luxurious and structurally sound. The construction process requires architectural planning. The pastry base must be shaped to accommodate the filling while maintaining the hedgehog's characteristic profile. The spines are attached individually, creating texture that's both visually striking and functionally necessary for even cooking. The entire creation is brushed with egg wash and baked in ovens that must maintain precise temperatures throughout the cooking process. Master Roger watches this construction with the fascination of someone witnessing magic. The transformation from raw ingredients to realistic hedgehog happens gradually as heat works its alchemy on pastry and filling. The kitchen fills with aromas that combine the comfort of bread baking with the luxury of exotic spices. When complete, the hedgehog looks so realistic that guests sometimes hesitate before cutting into it. The gravy that accompanies this creation is another marvel of medieval cooking. Master William creates it using techniques that transform simple ingredients into complex flavors. Beef bones are roasted until they develop deep brown colors, then simmered with wine, herbs, and vegetables to create a base that's rich without being heavy. The liquid is strained, reduced, and finished with spices that complement the hedgehog filling without overwhelming its delicate flavors. But the gravy's most important function is theatrical. When poured around the pastry hedgehog, it creates the illusion of the creature sitting in its natural forest environment. Garnishes of herbs and carefully carved vegetables complete the scene, transforming the serving platter into an edible landscape that delights the eye before satisfying the palate. The seasoning issue that Master Roger notes in his commentary reflects broader challenges in medieval cooking. Many of the exotic spices that reached English kitchens had traveled for months, losing potency along the way. Storage techniques were primitive, and spices often absorbed moisture, developed off flavors, or were adulterated by unscrupulous merchants. Cooks had to adjust their techniques constantly, working with ingredients of variable quality and strength. This uncertainty led to conservative approaches to seasoning. Rather than risk overwhelming dishes with spices of unknown potency, many cooks underseasoned their creations, preferring bland food to ruined meals. The wealthy could afford to waste ingredients in pursuit of perfect flavoring, but even royal kitchens had to balance ambition with practicality. Master Roger's cookbook reflects this cautiousness. Many recipes include phrases like "season to taste" or "add spices as seems good," acknowledging that written instructions can't account for the variables that affect actual cooking. The book serves as a guide rather than a rigid formula, assuming that readers will adapt techniques to their specific circumstances and ingredients. The production of the manuscript itself is a major undertaking. Master Roger writes in the formal script reserved for important documents, using expensive inks and parchment that will preserve the recipes for future generations. The pages are illuminated with decorative borders that incorporate food imagery, vines heavy with grapes, orchards laden with fruit, hunting scenes that celebrate the game featured in royal feasts. Each recipe is carefully formatted to balance practical utility with visual appeal. Ingredients are listed in order of use, with quantities specified when precision matters and left flexible when cook's judgment is more important than exact measurement. Preparation steps are described in logical sequence, with special attention to timing and coordination required for complex dishes. The cookbook also includes cultural commentary that reveals medieval attitudes toward food and cooking. Master Roger notes which dishes are appropriate for different seasons, religious observances, and social occasions. He provides guidance on menu planning, wine pairing, and table service that reflects the sophisticated understanding of hospitality that characterized royal courts. Some recipes include historical notes that connect contemporary cooking with classical traditions. References to Roman techniques, biblical foods, and exotic ingredients from distant lands demonstrate the international influences that shaped English royal cuisine. These connections weren't just scholarly flourishes. They were proof of cultural sophistication and worldly knowledge. The form of curie also serves as a window into medieval supply chains and trade networks. The recipes assume access to ingredients from across the known world: rice from Italy, almonds from Spain, spices from Asia, wines from France. This cosmopolitan approach to cuisine reflects England's growing international connections and the royal household's ability to command resources from distant sources. The manuscript includes practical advice for adapting recipes to local ingredients and seasonal availability. Master Roger understands that not every reader will have access to royal supply networks, so he provides suggestions for substitutions that maintain the character of dishes while accommodating practical limitations. These adaptations show sophisticated understanding of flavor relationships and cooking principles. As the manuscript nears completion, Master Roger reflects on the broader significance of his work. This isn't just a cookbook. It's a cultural document that captures English cuisine at a moment of remarkable sophistication and international influence. The recipes represent centuries of culinary evolution, from Anglo-Saxon simplicity through Norman refinement to the complex international fusion that characterizes 14th century royal cooking. The finished work will influence English cooking for generations, establishing techniques and flavor combinations that become traditional. Professional cooks will study its pages, adapting royal recipes for merchant households and tavern kitchens. Home cooks will attempt simplified versions of its most accessible dishes, spreading sophisticated techniques throughout English society. But perhaps most importantly, the form of curry preserves a moment in culinary history when imagination mattered more than orthodoxy, when cooks were encouraged to experiment with new combinations and techniques. The hedgehog in gravy, the blanc mange, and dozens of other creative dishes represent a time when English cuisine was confident, adventurous, and unafraid of complexity. So now, as you lie there, eyes heavy, limbs warm, mind drifting somewhere between honey cakes and fried eel, take a quiet moment to appreciate the little luxuries. A pillow that isn't made of straw, a room that isn't full of goats. Teeth. You still have teeth, probably. You live in a time where snacks don't squeak, where no one tries to sell you pigeon pie, where clean water is a right, not a gamble. And when you say comfort food, it doesn't involve animal blood and emotional compromise. Back then, you ate what you had. You boiled it, baked it, or fried it in questionable lard, and you were thankful. Not because it was good, but because it was warm and didn't bite back. So next time you burn your toast, or your coffee's not perfect, or the delivery app forgets your extra sauce, just remember, it could be worse. You could be chewing ale-soaked trench toast while watching a morality play about gluttony, sitting in a tunic that hasn't been washed since the Crusades. Tonight, you've walked through a world of flickering candlelight and suspicious cheese. You've survived fritters, curds, pies, dreams, demons, and digestive confusion. And now, finally, you get to rest. You're safe. You're fed. You are not, at this moment, being chased by a tax collector with a sharp stick. So close your eyes, let your thoughts soften, and drift gently like a bit of bread in spiced wine. Sleep well, my friend, and may your dreams be free of turnips, rats, and deeply judgmental fish.
you.